Thank you, Tanya. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm just going to offer a few words of introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over to the presenters, John, Mike, and Drew. The introduction of the book, The Transfer Experience, a handbook for creating a more equitable and successful post-secondary system, begins with the statement, "We don't treat transfer students very well." What a simple yet profound statement. As a former transfer student myself, I'm deeply grateful that the treatment I received at my own receiving institution many years ago was exemplary. But I understand as a practitioner, a scholar, and someone who considers herself to be an advocate for transfer students that this is really extraordinary when we look at the landscape of the transfer student experience in higher education. The book, The Transfer Experience, upon which this session is based, is the culmination of 5+ years of work that began with a 9-month planning grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But the research on and advocacy for transfer students by each of the book's editors and the many authors that are represented in the text began much earlier. That said, as I think you've seen over the last few days, I know I certainly have, there's never been a more critical time to focus on transfer. And by focus, I mean directing our attention beyond what might be referred to as fixing transfer. I know that's what I found myself preoccupied with when I was a practitioner and a professor, trying to help students navigate through the process of transfer. But really, we would need to move our attention to interrogating and ultimately dismantling unjust systems to create equitable educational experiences that are designed to help transfer students flourish. This plenary session will do just that, will inspire us to do just that. Drawing on and from the writings of the 17 chapters in the book, in addition to the robust online compendium of case studies, John Gardner, Mike Rosenberg, and Drew Koch will compel us in the most positive of ways to consider transfer as the entirety of a student's undergraduate educational experience at both sending and receiving institutions, and be less focused on the mechanics of transfer and more upon producing academically successful transfer students. It is now my pleasure to turn this session over to my colleagues, Drs. John Gardner, Mike Rosenberg, and Drew Koch, for what I know will be a thoughtful and thought-provoking session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Foote. I'm sure many of you in this audience have had the experience of being introduced in some way by someone who knows you really well. And if you're lucky to come out of that unscathed with the introducer not sharing something you would have preferred she or he not, you can call it a good day. And Dr. Foote has known me for about a quarter of a century, and there's a lot she could have told you about me that I'm glad she didn't. So it's a privilege, Stephanie, to have survived your introduction. And thank you very much. I know you prepared very thoughtfully for that. And although my mother's not here, I need to honor her by remembering my manners. I want to thank also Emily Cottrell of the staff of the National Institute for the Study of Transfer Students for the extraordinary support we have received from her for months. And now for her colleague Tanya Brooks for hosting this session. And of course, for the leader of the Institute, Dr. Janet Marling, whom we've known since she was on the staff of the University of North Texas, the founding origin of this conference and series and organization, and Dr. Benina Jacobs, the president of the University of North Georgia, whose original vision led to the establishment of the Institute. And we're so glad she continued this, brought it with her, and somehow conned Janet Marling into coming with her from Texas to Georgia. And I know, Janet, you're glad you were not in Texas last week. We'd also like to thank our editor at Stylus Publishing, David Brightman, who had the courage to publish this work. Publishing has become a very risky business. There's not much profit margin in it, and you take a gamble anytime you, particularly in academic publishing, which is nothing like trade publishing. So we are very appreciative that they're willing to publish the work of over 50 fellow educators that are included in the publication we're going to talk to you about. We also appreciate those of you who've joined us this afternoon as closers near the end, but not at the end of this conference. So we have one final connection I'd like to mention with the Institute, and that is the Gardner Institute has been privileged to serve on the National Advisory Board to the host organization for this meeting. Dr. Foote is currently our representative, and she was preceded by Dr. Betsy Griffin. This is all to say that we have a very important commitment to the National Institute for the Study of the Transfer Student as a key agent for reversing decades of discrimination and inequitable treatment for the largest subpopulation of American undergraduate students, the population that is the normative college student today, the transfer student. I and my two partners are going to make very brief introductory statements, and then we're going to move on. And we agreed that the one thing we were going to do in our introductions of a personal nature we were going to indicate what in the world is our own connection to transfer. So all I'm going to say about myself in this regard is that I do not have the wisdom and the empathy and the compassion that Dr. Foote, my kind introducer, has for transfer students, because I was never a transfer student, unlike Stephanie Foote. After my own undergraduate experience, my first major job at a university, I was a brand new assistant professor of history without tenure, and I got put on a committee in 1972 to do something for transfer students. And that was to design what I think is the best thing since sliced bread for transfer students, a Bachelor of Arts in Interdisciplinary Studies degree, to make it possible for transfers to receive a bachelor's degree that will accept all their credits, 90 hours worth. And we did this at the University of South Carolina. We've had about 10,000 students take that, earn that degree. And that was really my first introduction to the challenges of transfer students. And some years later, from 83 to 96, I was Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs for 5 of our campuses, where I saw firsthand the discrimination against my students from the university's 2-year campuses as they attempted to move to 4-year campuses within the system and beyond. And I have been, frankly, and I still am, furious about this. I'm really angry about this. And I'm going to try not to let my anger interfere with my clarity of thinking this afternoon. So Mike, let's pass it on to you. What are your connections to transfer?
Thank you, John. Well, my connection, well, first, hello, everyone. I'm Mike Rosenberg. I'm the Director of Planning in Penn State's Office of Planning, Assessment, and Institutional Research. My connection to transfer came from, I'm a student affairs practitioner by training, by choice, and by history. And I first got into the transfer area when I was the Director of Student Affairs and Academic Advising at the University of Cincinnati's College of Allied Health Sciences. I was the advisor for transfer students who were entering that college. So I got a taste of what transfer students went through, but I really got a much closer view of it when I moved from the University of Cincinnati across the river to Gateway Community and Technical College in Northern Kentucky, where I was their inaugural director of transfer. Working at it going from a 4-year institution to a 2-year sending institution really let me see up close and personal a lot of what these students coming from, each of which have great stories, where they are coming from and the challenges that they face. Through that time while I was at Gateway, I got to meet these two fine gentlemen as we were going through the colleges in the Kentucky Community and Technical College system. We're all going through the Gardner Institute's Foundations of Excellence transfer focus process. And some of them were also doing the 1st-year process at the same time, but we became acquainted then, which started our relationship, which has continued on and up and through the development of this book. So it's my pleasure to forward this conversation about transfer and social justice and creating a more equitable system. And with here, I will pass this over to my colleague, Drew.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, John. Colleagues, like my 2 partners in this publication, I was not a transfer student either. However, I did have the good fortune professionally early on in my career, days into my first job in higher ed at Hofstra University, to get responsibility for and begin working with transfer students. In that case, particularly transfer student transition into that 4-year university environment. I moved a few years later to Purdue University, where I was quite actively involved in various forms of transfer initiative and redesign of transfer initiatives. And then in 2010 came to the Gardner Institute. And since then have been working on more nationally focused as opposed to institutionally focused or regionally focused practices around transfer. Our Foundations of Excellence transfer process, both looking at the 2-year sending and the 4-year receiving missions, as well as a recent set of projects funded by ECMC Foundation to Ascendium, as well as some work in the Inland Empire in California, funded by the College Futures Foundation. While personally, I was not a transfer student, so I share the professional ones. Transfer still touches my life on a personal level, in that my wife and I are blessed to have 6 wonderful children, 4 of whom are in college right now, 3 of whom are transfer students. So we've experienced transfer, not just through 1 or 2 or 3 institutional lenses, but actually through 4 institutional lenses. 2 of those children started in community colleges, then transferred to regional comprehensives, and 1 was at a regional comprehensive, transferred to a public flagship, and then transferred back to a regional comprehensive. So we've experienced a lot of good, some bad, and a little bit of ugly, right? And that informs the action, at least, that I've been taking around transfer as well. Now, I'm going to spend a little time, very little time, I promise you, to tell you what we're going to do in the session now going forward. And Mike, if you would advance, great, thank you. We've given you our personal context for the work. John's going to give a little more context, the professional context for this work, this particular book, that includes with it a new conceptual definition for transfer and a reframing of transfer as a social justice imperative. Mike will spend some time going into that. I'll then spend a little bit of time illustrating the point about transfer being a social justice imperative by taking a look at what happens to transfer students at their transfer receiving institutions in gateway courses. John will then share a number of key recommendations, the recommendations found at the end of the book that we're fortunate to have written and published with the contributions from 50+ authors. And then allow you, with some questions and discussions, to think about, okay, we've heard this broader overview. How might we apply this at home, or share any other questions you may have? So that's what we have on tap for you in the time we have remaining. And without any more fanfare, I'll just turn it over to John so he can get us started on the new conceptual definition.
Well, I'm going to be atypically brief, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Drew, because you've already heard a lot of the context for the work that we're going to present to you today in terms of the previous work by the nonprofit Gardner Institute around transfer, and also the fact that we had the opportunity to do this book. But I do want to just mention how that opportunity came about. We were, the Gardner Institute was awarded in 2016 a 9-month planning grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to look at the current state of transfer in American higher education and to make recommendations to the foundation for their consideration for possible future investment and hope for efforts to improve the outcomes. When we finished that study over 9 months in 2017, we decided, well, what could we do? Obviously, it's up to the Gates Foundation to make decisions about what it does with what we found, but what else could we do? And we decided to take our findings and produce a book. And that's when we went to David Brightman at Stylus, and the end result is this work. Now, I'm engaging in what the Cartop guys in their wonderful radio show used to call shameless commerce by, calling attention to this work. But unlike those guys, I receive no income at all from this. And everything we're doing here is for the betterment of American higher education. So with that, we think the appropriate place to start is how you mentally define transfer, because how you define it determines how you act towards it. And we are approaching this differently. And my professional partner here, Mike, is going to talk about a new conceptual definition of transfer.
Thanks, John. If we're thinking about transfer, in general, when most folks, when you talk to people who are not as immersed in this sort of thing as we are, when you ask what transfer is, it's moving a student, or more accurately, a student's credits from one post-secondary institution to another post-secondary institution, or in the case of some students, multiple institutions. But it's that piece, the moving from one institution to another, that is where people focus. But that is not how we are defining things. If we're thinking about transfer students in general, now again, there isn't, and that's a little hard to say because no transfer student is the same as any other transfer student. They all have very different experiences. But I just want to try to generalize here. A transfer student, the typical ones they think about going from one institution to another, go through all of these steps. Before the institution, they have to apply, they have to get oriented, they get their initial advising, they move, they get into their first institution, they do their work at the first institution, then there's this transfer move, again, where they figure out where they want to go, they go to the second institution, and according to the way that we lay things out, they should then be able to finish up and graduate. And most institutions, their focus, their institutional focus, their energy, their political will tends to be here around the transfer move itself, the articulation of credits, the moving of a student from one environment to another. However, as we all know, that is inadequate. That is an inadequate definition and an inadequate focus for what students actually have to deal with. And so what are we saying transfer is at this point? We like to frame it this way, and my colleague John came up with a very good definition of it, which is the totality of the educationally purposeful experiences which we intentionally provide our students to enable them to pursue their educational and personal aspirations for academic movement from any of our colleges to another learning environment, enabling them to pursue a credential and or outcome which may not be available from their initial institution or context. So to sum that, so in another way, if you're talking about what the transfer experience actually is, the transfer experience actually lasts from the initial enrollment, when they first set foot on a post-secondary institution's campus or log in to a post-secondary institution's portal to get their educational experiences until they finish. That is where that is the totality of that experience is the transfer experience. And every piece of that deserves examination and optimization for their success. Because and thinking about it in those terms really gives us the notion to when we sort of dug into this, was thinking about transfer and dealing with the transfer experience as a social justice imperative, Because as we talk about, if we are talking about, the notion that we've all seen the numbers that 80+% of students who start at a community college eventually want to get a baccalaureate degree, but only 16% or in the teens do in a few years. But if we're thinking about social justice, we're going to think about it in these terms. I like to, I'm now in my role in strategic planning. We're big into let's define what we're talking about here. So we talk a lot about social justice. We talk a lot about equity. I think that every campus now, I think if you pulled up the mission and vision statement of your institution, and I don't care if it's private or public, 2-year, 4-year, whatever it is, if you're research or teaching, whatever your institution, everybody has things about social justice. We talk about equity and social justice a lot. We don't a lot of times talk about what we mean by it and how that relates to our world of transfer. Because typically, when most institutions talk about social justice, they use the frame laid out by this guy. And you say, who is this guy? Who is this gentleman here? This gentleman is Potter Stewart. He was a former justice of the Supreme Court. And he famously opined in the Jacobellis versus Ohio case, which was a First Amendment case. They were looking at obscenity. And he was talking about, it was a question about what is pornography and trying to define what pornography is. And he said famously, I may not be able to define what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. And so that is how most institutions think about social justice and equity issues. Well, we know it's a good thing, but really, what is it? What is it? What are we talking about here? So if we're gonna do work towards making a more equitable system, an equitable post-sec, we're gonna have to be able to assess it. We're gonna have to be able to see where we are, take an honest look about where we are, think about where we wanna go, and then sort of be able to measure our progress along the way. And if you're gonna do that, you need some guiding principles to define some attainable goals and objectives for making this stuff happen. And in doing so, my colleague Drew and I, this is in one of our contributions to the book, we came up with a theoretical frame to define social justice and transfer. And we pulled from a number of different areas. There was Burton Clark's famous his notion of cooling out, where the post-secondary system is set up to track some students away from a baccalaureate education. There's Bourdieu's social reproduction theory. There's Frankie Santos-Lannon and his concept of transfer student capital and the accumulation of transfer student capital to mitigate transfer shock. And then Herrera, Jane, and Bernal-Melendez's critical race theory and transfer receptive culture work. And I will just put in a plug here. If you hadn't read Power to the Transfer, the book that the three of them put out last year, which I believe that they had on sale at last year's NISTS conference, it's a banger. You should have a look at it. It's good stuff. So what we did, we took those things and we came up with some framing principles for defining what we should do as far if we're going to take an honest look at equity and social justice. First principle, that equity and access and opportunity is a positive institutional goal. I think we can all agree on that. We say that systemic conditions such as policies, practices, and processes may inherently advantage some students over others. 3, well-designed interventions can and often do improve outcomes for historically marginalized groups while maintaining and often raising expectations and standards for all students. And finally, ongoing advocacy and continuous evidence-based improvement are necessary for lasting change. So in thinking about this frame, for instance, and going back to this hypothetical transfer student of ours, each of these pieces of the transfer experience is a spot where there may be where you may uncover inequities. For instance, there are we can highlight a couple of them here. Thinking about advising when students come to a campus. Now, I am not going to wade into the professional advisor versus faculty advisor model or anything along those ways, because there are excellent advisors. My background is in academic advising. There are wonderful advisors out there of all kinds, but what you notice, good advisors, whether they're faculty advisor or professional advisors, they put in the time, and they put in the time because transfer advising is hard. And they put in the time because their institutions value that. And so if institutions don't put value, don't incentivize people to do transfer advising well, then it may not happen the way you want. That's one area where we can examine. This is one that I noticed here, transcripts. A lot of institutions, a lot of sending institutions have put, institutions in general, for unpaid, like say you have unpaid parking tickets, they won't release your transcript. And if a student is trying to transfer, and especially if it's a student who's a lower SES student, who may not have the money to pay parking tickets laying around, and they're trying to transfer so that they can finish a degree or continue along an academic program. If they're getting held up because of something like this is a problem. This is an inequity. Even something as small as that and can be a real detriment to a student's progress. Think about orientation for transfer students. When I was at the University of Cincinnati and I was advising transfer students coming into the college, we had for the first year students, for the incoming first year students, we had, a week-long orientation. We had a long orientation. For transfer students, it was at the time It was a meeting with, their orientation was a meeting with me, which again, maybe they got a lot out of it, but that's, or maybe they didn't. But that was the setup. That was how things existed at that time. Now, thankfully that's changed, and it's changed at many institutions, but that's something to think about. And think about going into majors. Some majors, especially popular majors, they only have so many slots, and they say, well, we can't open this up to upper class majors because we're focused on the students we're already focused on our students. If a student is transferring to an institution, they are your student. They are your students, and they deserve your work. So again, any of these pieces and many others that aren't listed on here are potential pain points. And it is in addressing those pain points, taking an honest look at what we are doing as educators and what we are doing in the institution is imperative to making sure that we are providing the educational experience that these students deserve. And again, I will allow, and at this point, I'm going to hand this off to my colleague, Drew, and he's going to focus on what you see just below it, the unjust design of some courses, of gateway courses, and how that affects transfer students. So I will pass this to Drew, and we will continue from there.
Mike did a wonderful job walking you through various aspects, dimensions, experiences, and the broader transfer experiences as defined by John. I'm going to take some time now to particularly focus on one such experience, the gateway course experience for transfer students at their transfer receiving institutions. Now, my dear colleague and mentor for nearly 3 decades, Dr. Betsy Barefoot, as we were talking through this chapter, initially responded with, I didn't know transfer students took gateway courses with their transfer receiving institutions. And so the resounding answer there is, as you'll see from the evidence that gets shared, yes, they absolutely do. And the outcomes in some given cases are not pretty at all. And it has a lot to do with unexamined and unquestioned design of those experiences. And the transfer experience, while in some ways not different from that of other students at the institution, actually is nuanced and has some implications that are unique to transfers themselves. Broadly, the assertions, the hypotheses behind this chapter and many chapters in the book itself, is that transfer is an unjust system, and that the unjust nature of transfer is the product, as I mentioned earlier, of its unexamined and unquestioned design, right? We do things the way we do because we've always done them. That's frequently an answer that we get to this. And that's what we're prompting, encouraging, more than nudging you to change, right? And many of you already do that. And so hopefully this book will help you and empower you to go even further than you've already done, right? Therefore, to change it, we have to examine the systems, in this case, the gateway course system that produces these outcomes. And in this system, transfer broadly, and the subsystem that's known as gateway courses with transfers, faculty are very much so and overlooked, yet a really primary agent of change in this area. Now let's dig in a little bit. This says coming soon. It actually just arrived on February 15th, right? But the book is The Transfer Experience. John and Mike already referenced that. But particularly now, I want to delve into a chapter called Momentum Stoppers and Equity Blockers, the implication of gateway courses for students at their transfer receiving institutions. I had the good fortune of writing this with my friend and colleague, Brent Drake, who's the Vice Provost for Decision Support at UNLV. Now, I will tell you, and to answer one of the questions from earlier, we will absolutely positively make sure that this deck gets in the hand of our friends at the National Institute for the Study of Transfer Students. And that means you can get it, so that as we go through these data slides, you'll have a copy of them for yourself at home. I'm going to go through these rather quickly. I've circled elements because that will help you focus on areas that I want to point out to you, right? In this analysis, as that black circle indicates, we identified 8 courses, 8 foundational courses ranging from, and they're listed in alphabetical order, right? Ranging from principles of accounting to a number of STEM courses, a number of humanity courses as well, right? So you have business, STEM, social science, and humanity courses in the mix. What you'll note here are a range between 31 and 34. We looked at the courses actually in a data set from 36 institutions. Not all of the 36 offered a course. They reported back to us what their foundational level course was. Offered a course, for instance, in principles of accounting, right? So 32 institutions of the data set of 36 did, 31 in general chemistry, 32 in calculus, right? So that's why those numbers differ a bit. The enrollment across those institutions that offered these courses range from a little over 13,000 in calculus to close to or just shy of 100,000, or at least over 90,000 in writing, English composition, as well as in general psychology, right? And what you'll note here then are the DFWI rates of D grades, F grades, W for any form of withdrawal on the transcript, right? Any form of withdrawal that was recorded, and I's for incompletes. Sometimes we get asked why we monitor incompletes, and the reality is based on what we've seen is they often turn into non-successful grades, Fs, when the student does not complete the course in a timely manner. What we wound up doing then is splitting that data into three components, and I'll delve into this a little more in the next few slides. But as you'll see in that column labeled E, we created a DFWI rate for non-transfer first-year students, right? We created another in column F for transfer students. And then we also created one for non-transfer upper level students, second year or higher standing based on number of credits, right? So that's how we did this analysis broadly. A quick example in general psychology, there were 34 instances of that, 34 institutions that reported having it with a little over 91,000 students. The DFWI rate for all students was 25.3. For non-transfer first-year students, it was 28.4. They had the highest DFWI rate. For transfer students in psychology, it was 22.3. And for non-transfer upper level students, it was 20.2. So just kind of gives you a sense on how this rolled. A quick summary on all of this. What you'll note here are the instance of which populations had the lowest, not the highest, the lowest DFWI rate in courses. You'll note in college calculus, introductory calculus, first-year students had the lowest DFWI rate. We believe that has something to do with the fact that A, they were calc ready, and B, they probably, or there's a high likelihood that they had math previously, at least relatively soon in comparison to some of the other populations. You'll note transfer students actually had the lowest DFWI rate in principles of accounting and general chemistry, and non-transfer students, upper level students, had all the other lowest DFWI rates. Now I want to point out the transfer students with the lowest DFWI rates in principles of accounting and general chemistry. We believe, we didn't have individual transcripts, right? At least not to be able to look at transcripts from the sending institution as well as the receiving. But we believe that this has something to do with institutional policies and practice that don't count prior learning at an institution where they took a previous accounting or chemistry course. We had frequently heard anecdotal comments to the effect that, well, the lab at the sending institution isn't quite the lab we have, or things along those lines. So the course needed to be retaken in chemistry, or their accounting is not like ours because we are AACSB accredited, right? So I'm not telling you these are the universal reasons. I'm telling you anecdotally speaking, we believe that the reason why transfer students have the lowest DFWI rates in those two courses has something to do with the fact that they probably didn't take that course for the first time at their transfer receiving institution. They probably took some variant before. Here are the instances where there are highest DFWI rates, right? First year students in 5 out of the 8 instances, and then transfers in 3 out of the 8 instances, right? 2 that pop out in particular are the math courses. And there our rationale, or at least our hypothesis, is that transfer students had probably a larger gap in time between when they last took math and when they took it at their receiving institution, right? So quick summaries on this. Transfer clearly matters. Transfer standing matters in complex ways in gateway courses. I share the accounting and chemistry exemplars where transfers had the lowest DFWI rates. I talked a bit about math as well, where they had the highest DFWI rates. I'd also say, or what we'd also say, and we said it in the chapter, is that there are numerous evidence-based pedagogies and strategies that can be used both within the courses and around the courses to help transfer students and all students improve. Good pedagogy is good pedagogy, right? So we're not saying you have to do something unique for transfers. We are saying there are reasons why we believe that they have both the successes and challenges they do at courses at their receiving institutions. Now, I want to take, and we did take a little deeper look, and we looked at both income and race ethnicity in the courses and the role it played. And here we compared transfers to other transfers, right? It didn't make sense to do otherwise. And what we particularly took a look at here in this instance was the DFWI rate of Pell eligible transfer students compared to non-Pell transfers, right? So in both cases, we're dealing with transfer students at their transfer receiving institution, and we're looking whether they were eligible for a Pell grant. That was our proxy for family income, right? And what you'll note here in that column is the DFWI rate for Pell transfers, and the green one is the DFWI rate for non-Pell transfers. Now, what we want you to take away in this one is this is the one instance, that little blue circle, where Pell eligible transfers had the lowest DFWI rate when compared to their non-Pell counterparts. These are the, and I want to just emphasize that because in all other instances, non-Pell students had the lowest DFWI rate. In other words, family income is a great predictor for who's going to succeed, even when controlling for transfer status. We also took a look at the DFWI rate for transfers based on race ethnicity. And particularly we examined African-American, or students who self-identified as African-American, Native American, Latinx, and white. And we're comparing the DFWI rate to the average transfer DFWI rate in the course. A quick summary here is that these are the instances where populations had the lowest DFWI rate. And you will note in all but one instance, white students had the lowest DFWI rate. White transfer students had the lowest DFWI rate when compared to their transfer counterparts. Here are the instances where transfer students, based on race ethnicity, had the highest DFWI rates. And you will notice in 4 instances, it's African-American students, and 4 other instances, it's Native American students. And by the way, it's not that Latinx DFWI rates in many instances were all that lower. The point is here, the key takeaway is that legacies associated with imperialism, racism, and classism manifest themselves throughout the undergraduate experience. And even in the transfer experience, even when comparing transfers to transfers, right? And so these are the elements that we would highly suggest you examine critically, constructively, but critically in your own institutional environment. The big takeaways in all of this are, again, transfer standing matters in very, very complex ways. Race, ethnicity cannot be ignored, neither can financial status. And the unjust nature of unexamined design just perpetuates inequity. Knowing this and having a structure in place allows you to begin to address and mitigate this over time. So I will leave it with that and ask my dear colleague and mentor, Dr. Gardner, to take it from here.
Okay, Drew, thank you very much for that wonderful foundation. I know I can speak for Drew when I invite all of you, recommend, urge all of you to partner with your institutional research office to collect comparable data on your own campus. We're finding that one of the most important stimuli to get change made is to share the kind of data you've just seen with the faculty who teach these courses. Most faculty, virtually all faculty, don't want these results. They're not aware, though, that these are the results they're getting, because this kind of evidence has never been shown with them. These are men and women who have social consciences, and they didn't get into higher education to produce these kinds of outcomes. So we're finding that this kind of evidence that Drew has just shared with you is truly one of the most important motivators for change, and we urge you to take that back home with you. As a result of all the work we did and all the people we involved, we tried to distill that work to, well, what are they telling us could be done to change these circumstances? Obviously, like other human beings, we all know what we've known, and we can't change what we've known. But what we can try and do is to look at what we've known through more objective lenses, and at least to say that we, those of us at the institutional level, have created the circumstances that lead to these outcomes. The transfer realities, by and large, are not shaped in Washington, D.C., or even at the state level. They're the result of institutional practices, traditions, and policies. And that's where we predominantly have to focus. Now, when I look at this, inevitably, I look at this in the course of my life career work, and I notice that this conference series, thankfully, is going on 20 years old. The same year, we just celebrated the 40th anniversary of the annual first-year experience conferences, which I founded in 1982. And one of the suggestions I'd like to, ways of looking at this that I'd like to ask you to take with you is that Drew and Mike and I are arguing that the most important distinction between types of students transcends race, ethnicity, gender, Pell status, et cetera, and is reduced to a transfer student versus a non-transfer student. Transfer students have fundamentally different college experiences in America. And that's why the transfer experience has to be adjusted. And one of the big differences is that the first-year students have now been the recipients of over 40 years for sustained high-level advocacy for improving their status. And American higher education listened to those pleas for improving the status of first-year students. And now 40 years later, first-year students are given far more treatment, attention, resources, action than are transfer students. So one of the most important corrective actions is you have to acknowledge that you're not going to improve their progress by maintaining the status quo. And that one way to do this is to make the status of transfer students a higher priority. How would you do that? All right, well, we lay out some examples in the book. You could, for example, give transfer students a higher priority in your institutional mission statement. You could give them a higher priority in your strategic plans. You could see that the talking points that your highest leaders take to the Rotary Club to talk about the important initiatives on your campuses include what you're doing for transfer students. The public statements that your leaders make and that you report in your public institutional communications have got to make more reference to this population. The metrics that you hold out for all of you to focus on as a measure of your success or lack of it have to include more metrics pertaining to transfer students. It's just been 2 years now approximately that transfer outcomes have been included in the IPEDS metrics. This is a start, but we need to go much further than this. You know, another way to do this is to work with your governing boards. Governing boards determine the highest institutional policy priorities, and you've got to get their attention for transfers. Drew and I are working on right now a major project with the Association of College and University Governing Boards to get trustees more invested in the student success work. We have a grant to do this. And one of the areas we're going to focus on is trying to give trustees a greater understanding for the inferior status that transfer students enjoy. You also have to look at who's responsible for transfer students. And are we vesting enough responsibility? And one of the most important areas for examination are the respective responsibilities. I'm going to get a little sensitive here when I mention this, wake some of you up. The responsibilities that are assigned to chief enrollment officers versus chief academic officers on most campuses by default, as well as initiative. the primary advocate for transfer student success comes out of the enrollment management office. And this means that the real experience of transfer students, which is their academic experience, is not as high a priority. So one of the very important practical things we have to do is to get chief academic officers and their staff more involved and vested as advocates for first-year students. Okay, another reality is the reverse design concept. If we want to provide more opportunities for transfer students, we got to have more of them complete degrees. And if the transfer experience is really the total educational experience, we've got to redesign undergraduate education so that transfer students get an academic experience that's roughly comparable to non-transfer students. So when you look at backward design, you have to look at what happens in community colleges to increase the supply of students in the pipeline who are going to move on to get baccalaureate education. That means the way we're doing orientation currently, introduction to career services, academic advising, not working. Well, they're working, but they're not sufficient. They're not generating enough attention and support for transfer students. The Guided Pathways Initiative right now it's the latest Kool-Aid, which many of us are drinking, is a focus on course presentation in terms of pathways. It's not focused primarily on the redesign of those courses in the pathways, which the students are still going to fail, just like they've been failing for decades, if those courses in the pathways are not redesigned. In community colleges, also, we've got to pay far more attention to the role that faculty play in the success of future transfer students. Are we offering required first-year seminar college success courses for transfer-bound students? Do you have a transfer center? These are very concrete, actionable elements that will make a difference for students at the sending level. At the receiving level, again, most of the four-year institutions do not make orientation required for transfer students. That is shamelessly irresponsible. What alternatives are you providing for your students whom you're admitting, but their grade point averages are not permitting them access to high status, high admissions majors? In other words, you're letting them in, but you're not letting them do what they really want to do. So what are their alternatives? What kind of special advising are you providing for them? What kind of special degree options do you provide for transfer students? Do you have something like a Bachelor of Arts in Interdisciplinary Studies? Are you adapting your college success classes, typically offered for first-time in college students, to your first-time transfer students? What are you doing about redesign of gateway courses, as Drew has just talked about? Again, how invested is your chief academic officer in the differences between different majors and departments and the attention and priority they assign to transfer students? Those are all corrective actions that could be taken, which would increase your pipeline flow. The third recommendation, very simply, is making more use of data to better understand who your transfer students are. How many of your students have entered initially at the two-year level, have indicated that they aspire to this? What are you doing for them? How are you targeting for the four-year students? Looking at on a disaggregated manner, where are these students coming from? At what point in their undergraduate careers are they transferring? How many hours are they bringing with them? What are their goals? What is their performance in your courses after taking aligned or non-aligned courses at a community college? Those are all important data sets that you've got to have in order to better understand these students. How do degree attainment rates for bachelor's degrees vary according to where the students transferred from? I want to suggest a recommended action. It's the two most dreaded words in the higher education lexicon. You cannot improve transfer outcomes without doing what we call in higher education a self-study. You've got to study the experience of the transfer students, and that has to be a data-driven, evidence-based process. We have lots of information on our website about how to do that. The Foundations of Excellence process, 70 institutions have done that. So that's an example. There will be no improvement in transfer outcomes without much more discussion the role of faculty and support for them to redesign courses and to align comparable courses. Drew and I were in a conversation the other day where we heard a senior officer at a flagship land-grant research university report that they take about 1,000 transfer students a year who want to take Calculus 2, coming in from one community college, and the DWFI rate of those 1,000 students is approximately 87%. Stunning. What does that tell us? It tells us there's no effort to align algebra and pre-calculus at the feeding community college between what's being done at the major university. So, faculty have been really avoided and downplayed in many of the student success initiatives. We're never going to improve transfer unless we engage them more in this. The next, we talk a lot about this in our book, is the identification of barriers to transfer student success. You've got to identify the barriers, and the people who are most aware of the barriers are the students. Ask the students. Often barriers are individuals. One individual can be a huge barrier to the entire progression of transfer students. That's one individual controlling one office, administering one set of policies that represent barriers. Barriers typically surround institutional rules and regulations, which we created, and they didn't come from Moses and his 7 tablets. Another way we would recommend that you look at this is to do a policy audit. Take the categories around which you have rules, from admissions, financial aid, eligibility for on-campus housing, priority for class registration, availability of selective admissions programs, eligibility for internships, eligibility for study abroad, eligibility for on-campus employment, eligibility for academic awards and prizes, and look at the experience of transfer versus non-transfer. And you are going to find, I promise you, gross discrimination, begging for a class action lawsuit. Another way you can look at this is like being an anthropological detective, is to do an audit of the institutional artifacts that are clues as to what extent you value transfer. Do you have photography of them? Do you have artwork that they've done? Do you have awards for them that you post? Do you write about them in your publications? How do you recognize transfer students in your publications? Where do they fall out on your website? How many clicks does a transfer student have to go compared to a first-year student to find what he or she needs? So that could easily be done. By the way, most all of these suggestions involve no costs at all. Okay, Drew, recommendation number 9. Your transfer students have a history. Where do you document the history and the accomplishments of transfer students? How are they celebrated? Do you have rituals and awards and honors to champion not only your transfer students, but those who champion them, the so-called transfer agents like you folks at this meeting? The next recommendation is really a simple one. It's a no-brainer, but most institutions don't have this. It doesn't cost any money. To establish a stakeholder institution-spanning advocacy group. Most institutions now have something like this for first-year students, which is why they're taken more seriously. You need an advocacy group for transfer students. Another thing you have to do is to develop peer-to-peer relationships between various types of officers at your institution, CEOs to CEOs, CAOs to CAOs, Chief Student Affairs Officers, Chief Student Affairs Officers, Chief Enrollment Officers, Chief Enrollment Officers, faculty in math, faculty in biology. These faculty alignment groups are especially important. Just can't emphasize them enough. Boy, is this a rush job. If you have the courage, and remembering if you can't stand the answer, don't ask the question. We urge you to do focus groups and surveys to ask your transfer students, how friendly are you? And be prepared for what they tell you. Understatement. And finally, I hope you're not superstitious about this. The 13th recommendation is to do what you're doing right now. This is one thing we don't want you to change, which is to keep supporting and participating in the major professional development experiences that are available for those of us who want to improve a lot. This annual conference in particular There are state and regional professional organizations that focus on advising and missions orientation, all of which support transfers. And there are state and regional organizations that focus just on transfer. There's the 45-year-old New England Transfer Association. There's the longstanding New York State Transfer Association, Transfer and Articulation Association. And there's even, on a state basis, the Alabama Transfer Student Success Conference, which gathers annually now as a mirror of this one. And there's the annual Students in Transition meeting that I founded with the University of South Carolina. So finally, with these recommendations, please remember and try to guide your work around a definition of transfer that goes beyond transfer as a stage of development, as a process, as a period, as an event. It's far more than that. You'll never improve it if you don't look at it as the totality of the educational experience. And please keep in mind that if you're really committed to improving social justice outcomes, you have to make transfer a higher priority. Mike and Drew, back to you.
John, thanks. We appreciate that you've listened to us, and we have a couple of minutes where we can take a couple of questions. I have a couple here that have come in during the course of our talk. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Drew, this is for you. It's a two-part question. What institutions were included in collecting the DFWI rate data? And were the courses evaluated by the same method for each of the receiving institutions, i.e. course descriptions or syllabi in this study?
Yeah, Wesley and David, glad you asked those, Mikes. Thanks for conveying those. From an institutional standpoint, we don't name the 36 institutions. We promise to leave them nameless. But there were 7 community colleges. The rest were 4-year. The variation between the 4-year were 4 independents, and then the rest ranged as publics, regional, as well as flagships. So it's skewed towards 4-year. But bottom line is relatively proportionally about student enrollment wise, it was representative of the broader higher ed sample. I don't want to emphasize, I don't want to press that one too hard. In terms of the method for it, we had student transcript level data. It was anonymized, but it did have demographic data. We had query IDs. So the method was the method we applied for determining DFWI rates, not institutions. So it was consistent across the board in that regard. I hope I answered that question. I want to leave time for others.
Yeah. Have a question here. How can you get the attention of your higher ups at an institution for support if they don't count transfer students as important? In a case like that, I think that it's important. I think that one of the things that's powerful or can be powerful about using a frame like social justice to discuss transfer is that allows you then to make a case to a broader slice of the institution than simply saying this is an enrollment management issue, this is an admissions issue. I think that especially in an issue, something like this, this is a wonderful opportunity to pull in offices of educational equity or do the ones who do DEI work on your campuses. I would say that talking to folks who are in academic affairs and whatnot, and getting the opportunity to get to bring these issues to light in things like whether it's committee work, whether it's simply passing along data, and whether it does require being a transfer champion and being a transfer advocate and agent as you move forward, and being open to making conversations. You have to be polite about banging the drum, but I think that people are receptive when you help them understand the stakes. Gentlemen, do you want to add something to that? John, you're muted.
In Kentucky for a long time, Mike, there was an example where one state legislator was such a conscience and advocate for transfer students, he changed the whole state's approach to transfer students. So I want to mention legislators, families, taxpayers, employers, all of these people are stakeholders and need more transfer students to get bachelor's degrees. There's also another category on all of your institutions, and those are the tenured senior faculty members with consciences who can speak up, who have more autonomy and power than staff do. And many of these people, once they really see the inequitable dynamics here, will join your championing for more opportunities for these students.
Okay. Do you think free community college will be a step in the right direction? We'll see if it happens, first and foremost.
Yeah, I'll handle that one, or I'll give an answer to it. And I will say that I speak for Drew and only Drew right now when I say this. Maybe, and I hope so. I think if we do free community college, but we don't address any of the dynamics that we just highlighted here and many others, then all we're doing is exacerbating a very, very unjust and flawed design, right? So if free community college leads to the type of enrollment changes that I hope it does, and we're serious about addressing the issues, then yes, it's a step in the right direction. But it's not the only step or sole step. It's not a cure unto itself.
Free is a word that means access. It means simply bringing them in the door. It doesn't change at all what you do for them after you admit them, which is exactly what Drew is saying. So that's why many of us are making a distinction now between access institutions and success institutions. And an example of this is the Pathways work. Pathways are designed to give more people access to attain degrees to transfer. But if all you do is to redesign the route, the mile markers along the route, the courses you have to take, without redesigning the courses, students they're not going to get through the pathway. That's an example of the distinction between access and success. I am a believer in free community college. I want to see that. That's going to yield more opportunity.
I have a good question from Nora, and I think I know where one place I know I'll go with this. Nora Kanzabach, other than NISTS, which conferences and or professional organizations would you recommend for people just beginning the work? I think that this is a good one. I think that I'll let John talk about the about the students in transition and the FYE work. I would think some of the work done by NACADA, by the academic advising world and its various regionals would be very helpful, as well as NODA. Looking at some of the orientation work, I think those would be useful. Others that you would throw out there?
Mike.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
No, you go ahead, Drew.
This falls under that shameless commerce clause that John had invoked earlier. But we started on Monday, we, the Gardner Institute, a series called Socially Just Design in the Post-Secondary Educational Experience, or in Post-Secondary Education, a series. And we'll be doing a chapter. These are virtual installments on transfer, and we'll be involving NIST there. So that's an option as well. It's a very focused, about 3.5 hours with case studies, things along those lines. So I wanted to put that out there simply because, well, you asked, right, John?
Well, it occurs to me, and I thought about that before this question, but the examples we're giving all are looking at something that is not the totality of the transfer experience, which is the educational experience. That's not what advising is. The educational experience refers to the courses that students are taking, which means that if we don't get these kinds of discussions built into academic discipline meetings in various subject matters that transfer students have to take, we're not going to get faculty to redesign their courses, to be more thoughtful about how to teach transfer students. This is a major area. We have a project on right now with the American Historical Association to redesign a basic course that all of your transfer-bound students take, U.S. Survey History, where Black students are getting DWFI rates at twice the rate that white students are, which means we're going to have twice as many white transfer students as we are Black students. So we've got to get faculty at the discipline level more involved in these discussions, in addition to the sources for professional development that you just cited.
I saw there were a few questions around engineering, and I just wanted to comment that we didn't do an analysis by program of study. We did the analysis by course. However, my colleagues, Shawi Abdullah out of Georgia Tech, they apparently know something about engineering, and Greg Hallman out of the University of Arizona. They're both electrical computing and engineering colleagues, and they're fellows at the Gardner Institute as well. They've been doing a lot of work around student float into and through engineering curricula. So for those who ask the questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to make some connections there and keep the conversation going.
And given that, I see that we have gone a few minutes. We have gone a few minutes past. If you want to go ahead and go to the, we are more than happy to carry on these discussions. We are available to chat with, or to consult with, or to bounce ideas off of. There are our email addresses. Please feel free to reach out to us, and we would be more than happy to share what we can with you. Thank you so much, and thank you to the great folks at NISTS for giving us the opportunity to present this to you, to share this work with you. I hope that it'll prove useful to you moving forward.
Mike, we've just had a message from Tanya Brooks telling us that we have about 8 minutes left.
Oh.
Are there any more questions?
If there are other questions, then if there are, please feel free to ask.
While we're waiting for more questions, I would just like to suggest that if any of you actually get the book, one of the hopes we had for it was that all of it, but especially the recommendations, could be used by a task force, a study group, or an advocacy group. You could take our recommendations and ask yourselves, how many of these are we already implementing? Could we do this? Should we do this? This work was subtitled A Handbook. There's some really interesting theoretical, substantive research, like you heard from Drew, that's reported in this work, but fundamentally it's a very practical and applied work. We've asked if you had more questions. I'm wondering, would anybody like to share a reaction to something they've heard? Has it stimulated any thoughts or epiphanies for you, or something that you may be moved to do or to try that you haven't previously? I'm asking for some risk-taking here in self-disclosure.
I'm not sure that they can speak back in this.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Mike. Okay.
Oh, can you tell? We have a. Do you see the? I have a question here from Batani. Do you see the articulation process as a barrier for transfer students?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Short and sweet.
Yes. We were fortunate, the Gardner Institute's been fortunate, and we had a good long chat about this during one of our bi-weekly staff meetings. John and I love those, by the way. Anyway, but to begin some work with the American Council for Education's Blockchain Innovation Challenge. And we're doing that. I had mentioned colleagues at Georgia Tech and the University of Arizona. We're doing that in conjunction with them because articulation is at best something articulated. It actually isn't necessarily something that manifests itself in the real lived experience of students. So just because you have a guaranteed transfer block does not mean, and you know this, that it actually applies towards programs of study. Reference earlier the outcomes associated with accounting and with chemistry, right, with transfer students having the lowest DFWI rate. So there's the promise, or the stated promise of articulation, and then there's the actual lived experience. What we're hoping to do with tools such as blockchain, but there are other ways to do this as well, is to make what actually gets applied transparent, so that students, for example, a student who receives Pell Grants and only has 8 terms of eligibility for a Pell Grant doesn't show up at an institution and suddenly finds out they have 4 terms of Pell left, but actually 6 terms of study to go, right? So there are challenges there. There's promise. Without articulation agreements, you absolutely positively need them, but then you have to actually make sure that what's articulated gets applied to the program of study. other colleagues.
Drew, I'd like to mention a free resource. We think a fundamental question about all of undergraduate education to ask, including transfer, is if you had an excellent transfer experience, meaning the totality of the transfer student educational process, what would that be? What do you have to do to be excellent at transfer? And some years ago, we created a set of 9 aspirational standards for achieving excellence in transfer. They are available on the Gardner Institute website absolutely free. And you could pull them off the website and you could adapt them and create your own. A real need is to be able to be concrete about what would we need to be doing in order to be better as a transfer, either sending or receiving institution. And I think those standards might be of help to you. Drew and I are fortunate enough to, our organization has received a grant from the, with the SHIO, the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association. They are the principal investigators for a grant from the ECMC Foundation. ECMC is funding 5 different projects to improve transfer at state levels. And we're going to be working with 4 states to examine their transfer movement process across both public and private institutions, which means that this will be coming to a campus near some of you in this audience, because some of you inevitably are going to be from these 4 states. These 4 states have not yet been selected, but we're doing this as a kind of laboratory for a broader national effort. But again, I think that standards would be helpful to you, and they're available free. You can find them on our website.
Wonderful. I have someone sharing out here. I'm it's from Eric. I'm a content instructor, part-time PhD history, and a full-time academic advisor. Can't the cultural capital teaching that advisors do with students be developed into something that is also a core part of the intellectual experience for students? You emphasize the academic affairs side of the house is the more important, and just for the sake of argument, I want to push back a little, he says.
Yes.
And I would agree that that can certainly be and the cultural capital piece, it also feeds into some of the part of the frame that Drew and I put together, is the Frankie Santos Lannis transfer student capital pieces pulls directly from that cultural capital work.
So I'm wondering at that campus, Mike, where this individual is, how is that kind of thinking influencing the content and design, especially of college success courses and other introductory courses that transfer students have to take? That's exactly the kind of thinking that we need.
Yep.
We know that one of the differences between transfer and non-transfer students is the presence or absence of social capital. And it just doesn't fall out of the sky. It's taught, it's learned. Drew has 6 children, and the 4 that are transfer students, believe me, have been taught the social capital they need to be successful.
And now I do see that we are at time.
This time you mean it.
I'll let Drew respond to that though, if he wants to.
No, as my John was sharing this, so I'll just add one last element. And 2 of the 4 or 2 of the 3 that are transfers actually came to this country just shy of 7 years ago. And when I was concerned and I spoke with one of them, given the lack of social and cultural capital that they had, not only coming from sort of the structure they came from, but also just being new to the US, he responded, Drew, I have 2 parents with PhDs. I know where to go to get answers, right? And I mentioned that. I said to him, well, my bigger concern then is, do you have other classmates who don't have parents who are PhDs who need answers, right? So anyway, I mentioned that. Yeah, they have certain capital and privileges that others don't, but that's why we must be mindful, very much so, of who our transfers are, and why we're grateful that you are. And Katie, by the way, Giardello, with the how articulation process acts as a structural equity barrier. Keep up that awesome work. We want to know more.
I think you've also just reminded us, Drew, more broadly, that transfer students are really immigrants, immigrating into a culture where they don't know how the culture works. And they're discriminated against in a country that doesn't welcome immigrants. but was built on immigrants.
They get the job done.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Thank you all. Let us hear from you.
Let us hear from you, everyone. Keep it up, and I hope that this helps you march forward, and the work continues. So thank you for being a part of it.